Well, hey, y'all. Joseph, welcome back to the podcast here at Oak Grove United Methodist Church. Delighted to have you today as we're talking about some of the things around the Oak Grove neighborhood and what it means when we say Oak Grove. Is it a neighborhood? Is it a church? Is it some of all of it together with the neighborhoods combined? Delighted today to have our church member, friend, and community member and guest, Tom Branch, here. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
And Tom, I see many places, from the pool to the neighborhood to the park, to all these different places, and of course, obviously here at the church. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Frazier-Rowe Park and some of your experience in helping cultivate that and craft that over the years, but also your involvement in the neighborhood and the community in many other ways. Now, before we get to that, we always start off with the vision statement for the church, because Oak Grove is a church in a neighborhood, sort of functions as a downtown county seat church that happens to be in a neighborhood. That's how I describe it for friends who are not from around here. But the vision of Oak Grove United Methodist Church is to build inclusive, life-changing communities and experience transformation in Jesus Christ. We do this together by connecting with each other, growing in our faith, and living out our faith in the world. And so, we'll start off the same question we ask most everybody, Tom, is who are you and how did you get here? So, Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I should be able to answer that one. I'm a native Atlantan. I grew up near Emory, went to Druid Hills High School.
Wow.
And grew up at Glen Memorial Methodist, so I'm a lifetime Methodist. Then went to Emory and then Georgia Law School. So I've been practicing law, private practice, since 1980 in the Atlanta area.
Yeah.
Lived in DeKalb County for a while, moved back to this area in the late 80s, and I guess I joined this church around 2000.
Okay.
David Hancock was the senior pastor.
Nice long tenure here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. One of our staff members, Diane Osteen, worked for the bar for a while, and she knows all the lawyers in town. I told her I was going to have you on, and she was excited.
Ran it. She was great.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
When someone says that the thing you know when you work in organizations is there's always somebody who kind of holds it all together.
Yes.
And I think that certainly was her then and now. Here in Decatur, in our area, you're involved in a lot of things. But let me just start with some of your time in ministry here at Oak Grove, and then we'll move into sort of the neighborhood part of things. So
sure.
I know you've done a lot of things at the church, but what are some of those things that you do now or you've been involved in?
So I had been a longtime visitor here.
Okay.
And finally joined, and after some shaming by different people.
Okay. And by people I hope are friends still.
Yes.
Okay.
But I guess because I'd been a visitor for so long, I didn't really get very involved. I was an usher. And a neighbor of mine, Ted Harris, who was a member, said, Tom, I noticed that when you join organizations, Kiwanis, PTA, things like that,
sure.
You get heavily involved and end up in a leadership position, but not at the church. I don't notice that you're really involved in it, which was true. And I don't know why that was, but I spoke to a friend of mine who was heavily involved, had been on the staff, and told her that if she saw an opportunity, that I would be interested in doing something. Well, at churches, you don't have to raise your hand very long. And so I got a call from somebody on the nominating committee and asked me if I would be willing to serve on staff parish relations committee. Okay. Well, I didn't know what that was. Sure. And in hindsight, that's
they probably even just said SPRC. And
SPRC.
You're like, what is that?
And that's really jumping in on the deep end because sort of we're talking about staff people I didn't even know.
Yeah, and sort of the HR function of the church. Every church has a board that helps govern it, made up of lay people of the church and some of the pastors and ex officio non-voting members. But then there's this group, this subset, that helps oversee the hiring, firing sometimes, healthcare benefits, salaries, all that.
Yes. But that was how I got started. And I was was chair of that one year, last year. Been a lay delegate to annual conference. Yeah. As you know, I was head of the invitation committee, so I was involved in that for a while. Still an usher, serve on the cemetery committee. Oh, yeah. So I'm sort of aging out of these other things and moving on to the cemetery.
Receiving new people in the cemetery.
Yes.
And the Oak Grove Cemetery is its own organization that has many church members who are a part of it and has a long and good relationship with our church and community.
Right. Yeah. No, that's been good.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you've done a lot of those things, and I'm sure you have lots of stories, some which you can and can't tell. But I think it's worth mentioning, since we're talking about the neighborhood and about sort of the Oak Grove area, some of how you see the church fitting into the neighborhood a little bit, both sort of then and now. As someone who moved into the area, what were some of your first sort of experiences and understandings of the church when you were, if you can recall those?
Well, the church reaches out pretty effectively, I think, to the greater community,
Yeah.
which is part of the invitation
Yep.
part that you mentioned and that I was involved in through the barbecue, big projects like the food drive, Spooky to Be Hungry, and then the Feed My Starving Children. Brings a lot of people in, either as workers or just people to eat the barbecue.
Yeah. I mean,
the preschool, I mean, it serves so many people in so many ways. First, you're being a good neighbor.
Yeah,
right, to the neighbor. It's not exclusive. Oh, you're not a member. You can't do this. You can't do that. That's never the answer. And then people, come and participate and realize, hey, this is a place I'd like to belong and find my spot here.
These people are okay.
These people are okay. Yeah,
we sort of joke about it in lots of ways. People find their way to this church. As part of my job, I help welcome new people and help them find a place of belonging, get connected with people, and then also find ways to use their gifts and talents for the church and for the community.
Yeah.
My official title is Pastor of Connection. It used to be Invitation and Hospitality. In the old days, we called it Minister of Evangelism.
Oh, that scares people away.
Which immediately makes people close their doors and hang up the phone. So part of my work, the good word evangelism, is of the good news. So sharing the good news. Well, the good news is that at this church, in the old days of church, you had to behave like a Christian, become a Christian, and then you belonged. Oak Grove has done this for years in your time and mine, where you belong here, and we'll sort the rest of this out later.
Yes.
And that sounds like your journey with membership and making that official commitment. And this is something I share with people often is we want people to find their place of belonging here, to find a place where they know that they are loved and accepted by God, that they are valued, they have dignity and worth, and that this church is a place of both comfort and challenge, that there are many opportunities to be involved in mission and service, as you mentioned. Of course, the barbecue and all these fun and good things that help us fellowship and build up our neighborhood. And that there are a lot of good things that we can do with our faith, with our resources, and with our very own being in the world and in the neighborhood. So yeah. That's kind of cool. I know part of when you and I see each other at the pool or wherever we might be, there's always people you know. And you're one of those people that I think knows a large number of people across a large strata of areas and things. In my doctoral work, we talked about people being what they call boundary leaders. And they're people who are able to cross over typical boundaries of race, class, strata, language, all these different ways that people can sort of move between those places and be themselves. That's the key, is not that you're trying to shapeshift from one thing to the other, but that you can be at a fundraiser and a gala for the bar association, and then you can go work in the garden at the park, and then you can go help us make sandwiches for folks experiencing homelessness. That It's sort of all those things, and you are still yourself in those places. And also, you help connect other people to those places and interests. And so one of those interests I know you have is the Frazier-Rowe Park and green spaces and community formation. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about Frazier-Rowe and sort of its beginning and how you got involved with the project.
Sure. Well, the county bought that land, the bulk of it, the initial land, back around 2010 or 11 from a developer.
Okay.
He had actually assembled it with the idea of building townhomes. And, 2009, nobody's building townhomes.
It was a rough year for trying to build anything.
That's
a good point.
So negotiations took place with the county, and the county bought the land. I got a call from a friend of mine who monitors this kind of thing. And he said, hey, the county has bought some land across from where you live for a park. And would you be interested in meeting me there and walking through it?
Yeah.
And I said, well, great. But what land? Across from where I live, across from Vista Grove Shopping Center. And he said, well, it's the wooded area right next to Sprigg Restaurant.
Oh, yeah, right there.
And my question to him was, which I heard many times later as we worked on it from other people when I told them where the park was, what wooded area next to Sprig? Because it was so, not only were the woods overgrown, but there was a border area between the parking lot and the tree line and La Vista and the tree line, which was just this mass of privet and mimosa and thorns and trash and tall weeds.
Wow.
So that you could see that there were trees there, but it wasn't very inviting.
Yeah, it was not that nice park-like understory. It was the overgrown privet that you don't want to walk through.
No, that's exactly what we had. So before we could do anything, we had to get rid of that. But anyway, walked through it, and you could see the potential. And the way these things work is when the county buys land, is they schedule a series of meetings for the community to talk about, what would you like in the park to have in the park. Yeah. And people were talking about Frisbee fields and dog parks, and well, you can't put
it's kind of hard to do that with the existing trees there.
Yes, especially a Frisbee. So and we'd have one of those I'm not a big meeting person, and we would have one of those meetings. That's probably obvious. But,
even for being a Methodist. Right?
Yes. And you would have a meeting, and then 6 weeks later, you have another meeting and sort of go over the same thing.
Sure.
And finally, I went up to the lady that was running the meetings, and I said, we can't do anything there until we get it cleaned up. And I would be willing to lead that.
Okay.
And so she said, sure. It's kind of like raising the hand at the church,
Yeah.
And because I had done that kind of work at my daughter's schools, the public schools, Briar Lake, Shamrock Middle, and Lakeside. Okay. Organizing running workdays. Yeah. And so the first thing, we got rid of that border area, paid somebody to do that.
Yeah, that's good use of finances.
And then you schedule a workday. And you create an email list, kind of like what you're talking about, people you know.
Sure. And
I've lived here a long time. So from those school activities, the pool, tennis.
That's right.
Church, anybody I can think of that might be willing to do me a favor and show up at that first workday.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you can have a long list, but there could be nobody.
Yeah.
We had it February of 2013, I think, and we had 60 some odd people come.
Wow.
We got so much done. It was just unbelievable.
That's nice to see that kind of effort come together.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
And what's nice with the park is it's sort of in between different areas.
Yeah,
it's sort of across the street from Leafmore. On the back side, on the Coralwood side, it backs up to Sagamore Hills and, of course, Oak Grove Road. So we drew people from all over.
That's true.
And also, great connection with the church was we had Boy Scouts come. Yeah. And, that's a ready supply. Our first Eagle Scout project came from a boy that was there.
Perfect.
That first day. It's just great.
Yeah, and troop, our troop here is remarkable and has sort of a large following and some great stories over the years. But it's
Absolutely.
Just a wonderful,
this
wonderful
boy built
scout
a bridge over that creek.
Oh, yeah.
And before that, we were, you were having to sort of stumble over the
jump across
rocks.
I go across that bridge very often.
Yes,
I didn't know it was an Eagle Scout project.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the process, and we still have monthly work days. Okay. We don't, we get 15 or so, and the projects are more limited, but we've kept up with that. Have maintained the park pretty well. One of the neat features of it, I think, is the developer that I mentioned, Rick Porter, lives in the neighborhood, and he's a descendant of the Frazier family.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Frazier Road is named after that family.
Yeah.
People ask me, why is Frazier-Rowe Park not on Frazier Road?
Well,
it's not road, it's row. But I think in the sale documents, there was something that specified that the name of the park needed to include those two names, the family names.
Yeah.
And so that was done.
Okay.
And that's a little unusual in this part of the world.
Sure.
That you would have that kind of marriage
document
of a black family and white family. And we've, in fact, had programs there with representatives of the two families and talk about the area and growing up. And, of course, different memories. Mr. Rowe that spoke talked about going to segregated schools nearby, and so it was very different world, but they got along well. That was what was so cool. And I think even Rick Porter didn't realize how close the connections were between the two families. And one of the programs we had, one of the people sitting there said, so this was actually a black area where we are, the park. And both people from both families sort of shook their head and said, that's not how we saw
It's
it.
not really how we did that.
It's sort of, unfortunately, it's in some ways how we see things now.
Yeah.
But he said, back then, that's not how we saw it. We all sort of lived together. Nobody really had much money.
Sure.
And, we helped each other as we could.
Yeah, I think that's one of the neat things about that. The AME church is right across the street from there and has a long historic presence there, as well as the Baptist church around the corner, and other neighborhoods and other parts of things that might be a little different than other people's experiences, especially here in Atlanta, given our civil rights history, but also a deep history of segregation and challenges and violence and all those things in the city.
Yeah.
So to hear that's more of a collaborative and a good understanding with our neighbors, even though they might be of different race or experience. That's powerful.
Yeah.
You invited me. I came here 7 years ago to be on staff, and in I think 2018, 2017, whenever the dedication of the park was, you had me come out and offer an interfaith prayer, which I'm well versed at and working at Emory and other places. I remember. And some of the family members were there, and I remember being struck by how well they both parts of the family shared some of those stories, and how it was much more of a collaborative effort in their work, and certainly different experiences of how everything felt to them, if they be in a part of the family that was Black or that was white, and how it, when they share those stories, there's a deeper understanding for the community.
Yes.
And how the park, in many ways, at least what I see, represents some of that understanding of racial healing and working on that, some reconciliation in some ways.
Yes. I'm involved in something like that now. It's called Piney Grove Cemetery. It was small. This happens with churches. Church close, it has a cemetery. There's a problem. Well, in this case, this was a African-American Baptist church in Buckhead off Lenox. Church closes. All the development is going on there. The land is sold to developers who build big townhomes. The cemetery becomes isolated, landlocked, doesn't have any road access, and isn't maintained, and it's just awful. And so there was an article in the paper, and I saw that, and it's kind of like the experience with Frazier-Rowe. I thought, I've done this before.
Sure.
I can help with that. And so, and some of these people were enslaved. I mean, it goes back that far, and now their cemetery is neglected and overgrown and awful.
Sure.
So it's just not right.
Have y'all been able to connect with some of the descendants of those folks who were buried there?
Yes.
Okay.
It's led by two sisters whose grandparents are buried there.
Wow.
But I was, at our last workday, I was standing next to a man about my age, and he said, these are my grandparents.
Wow.
He said, until recently, I didn't know where they were buried. I don't mean didn't know in this cemetery. He didn't know what cemetery they might be buried, or if they're even buried in a cemetery.
Man.
And he was overcome, really. And you realize, I mean, this is underbrush that's 12 feet high in places. It's so bad. But there are other graves that are marked there, and, there are families in Atlanta, and there are folks involved in this effort who are going to help find those families and reconnect with them. So
that's really important, especially when we talk about the legacies, both positive and negative, we have in Atlanta and we have throughout the South around slavery. Reparations means simply like repairing something that is broken and helping that thing not keep breaking.
Yes.
And so when you think about how we do good things like that, that sounds like a perfect example of sensing that call to jump in when you can. And you've done things like this before, so sure, I can clear some underbrush. I can organize a work day. Yeah. But also in helping those two sisters lead the charge to help do that as an ally. That's really important work, Tom.
And I try to make clear to them, this is their project. I'm helping with this underbrush and clearing, but there's a lot of work that's going to follow that in terms of identifying. They've done some soil tests where you can tell if might be a grave in an area. Sure. There are places where it looks like there was a grave that have sunk, but no headstone. And there aren't always headstones. Right. There may be a field stone of some kind. Sure. So it's hard, but at some point, it'll be turned over more for that kind of work, which is really important. Well, and it's really meaningful for people, especially to know where their ancestors are. As you mentioned, the gentleman who did not know where his grandparents were, but now to know where they are. Yes. And there's something so meaningful about
again, trying to, it's not digging out the past to make things uncomfortable for people. It's trying to get some answers and trying to help honor those people, whether they have a marked grave or not, that values their dignity and their humanity. And for us as Christians, that we're all made in God's image. So I think that's a really, that's a remarkable project, Tom. Thank you.
And you really feel like you're doing God's work from that standpoint. And it's not, some of the bad things happened, in my lifetime.
Sure.
I think the extension of Georgia 400 wiped out some of there were those black enclaves in the Buckhead area.
Yep.
And for the most part, they're gone. That's why that church had to close.
Yeah.
And sort of a disregard for, those communities.
Yeah. And again, those systems and structures are still often at play, and doing the work to repair some of those damages and trying to help them not happen again is absolutely, I think, the work that we're called to.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had work days, and they've had volunteers. We've had a large group from the Church of Latter-day Saints. They do a lot of volunteer work.
Sure.
Someone else saw the article in the paper and
jumped in as well.
Yeah. So,
well, I think that's definitely one of the parts and functions of how people get information in our world is that you see something, and if it, again, I'm not a real Pentecostal person in the sense of sensing God's presence and spirit to calling me to something, but part of my prayer often is, God, help me pay attention to things that I might need to pay attention to.
Yes, paying attention, and then when you see it, speak up.
So in the Frazier-Rowe Park, you started off, did the work days and all that part of things, got the dedication done. And before that, I know y'all got some grants and different things to get some different structures and things. Tell us some about what's in the park and what's going on there now.
Yeah, there's an organization called Park Pride, which is a nonprofit, sort of works between the government park department, so DeKalb County, City of Atlanta, and now some of the new cities in DeKalb, Brookhaven, and Tucker, between those groups and the Friends groups. Initially, at that workday, there was somebody from Park Pride there with tools and know-how.
Oh, that's helpful.
Which helped with all the 60-something people. I was a little overwhelmed.
It's a lot to manage 10 young people with brush axes.
Yeah. So they also, though, have a grant program. And we have some of what we've done there has been through those grants. So we have a pavilion where we can have programs. We have paved the loop trail in the front
to make it accessible.
More. Absolutely. That was always part of the initial mission.
That's great.
And then we have picnic tables and a little playground, so things like that, all through those grants. And we've raised some money because you have to have matching funds. And we've learned what works and what doesn't work.
Sure.
Book sales, not so much.
not for the park.
No.
For the church, that does pretty well. But
for the
park, Well, I think that's really neat to know how to find those resources and tools, but also to make it a beautiful place in our neighborhood. I'm over there often as a photographer and video person because early morning sun coming through beautiful trees. Yeah. Those are things that are sometimes hard to find, but there are beech trees, white oaks, there are all kinds of ferns. These are all the native plants that, in addition to the ones that have been planted, but just remarkable trails. It's a really beautiful area. And for me, as somebody who longs for quiet, contemplative spaces, living in the middle of a city, or just a good trail that I could walk a half mile on and then go back to doing what I was doing, it's an easy walk to get there, or an easy bike ride, or a little drive. Park in the shade. I can push a stroller around there. My daughter could use her wheelchair or walker on the paved parts. We've done our family pictures out there. But there's all sorts of benefit for people, but also just a place to get out and think. The little bridge you mentioned over the creek, and it's fern lined all the way up, and it's beautiful leading up the hill there. And so it's just a remarkable park. On the parking side, there's a whole host of flowers and gardening that happens there and seasonal things. Is there anything you want to say about sort of that work?
Well, there's a woman named Brenda Busby who's there all the time. Yeah. And she does all that. And she would shake her head and say no, but she oversees it and is very diligent. You have to stick with that. Okay. And almost all of that was in that awful border area that I'm talking about. Yeah, and so we hired a landscaper he cut everything down to the ground, but it was not really good soil, as you can imagine, stumps and so forth. So she's had to deal with all of that over time.
Yeah.
But the trails, I think, are special. And the minute you walk in this summer heat, the temperature, you feel the temperature drop 5 to 10 degrees.
Drops 10 degrees when you're down by the creek. Down there.
Absolutely. And I see a lot of people. I used to see Amy Morgan, our now retired associate pastor, and she said she would walk on the trails and sort of work on her sermons. And one day we were having a work day Saturday morning. We were down by the creek, and all of a sudden there's Amy. And I think she was preaching the next day, and she said, working on the sermon. So I introduced her to the other fellows that were there with me, and we spoke for a minute, and then she turned to walk to her car, and she turned around and said, "And Tom, I'll see you tomorrow." And I must have given her a blank look. I mean, what? You're seeing me tomorrow? And then I realized, church. Yes,
right.
Yes, I'll be there. Tomorrow's Sunday. Yes, I'll be there.
Oh, yeah, I'll see you there.
Yeah, I'll be there. And you'll be there, I know. So,
that's fun. And I do think there are lots of, when I'm there, often, especially when I've dropped the kids off and I need sort of a transition moment before I head into the office here at the church, I'll often go by there and just walk around, whether I've got my camera or my phone or just my own listening ears to walk through and just listen, to see the beech trees, to go up the hill, to go down the path. There's all sorts of interesting plants. I'm a tree nerd. I think you already knew that. But beech trees are one of my favorites. And there are a whole stand of beech trees, young and older, that are through there. They're quite beautiful.
One way I've sort of learned about the area is we've had a couple of programs with naturalist or arborist.
Yeah.
And a woman who's done the program a couple of times has mentioned, she said, when you're in the front part of the park where it's flat, these are sort of new growth trees, pines, sweet gums, poplars.
Yeah.
And, but the minute you start to go down to the creek, it changes. So something, that tells you something. And then when we had the program about with the two families, somebody mentioned that before the shopping center was there, that was a horse farm of some kind.
Okay.
Well, that front part was part of that horse farm. So those trees, they're new growth because they're new growth.
They're early successional species. Yeah,
that's a more
it's the
naturalist
the forestry nerd term.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's true. And it is like one of those things when you go down into the ravine area there where the creek is and where that Eagle Scout Project Bridge is, that it does change.
Yeah.
But things like that are both educational and, for me, spiritually enriching. You get to see some of that and feel it. Even when you are walking somewhere and you notice a temperature change, it helps you pay attention to the world.
Yeah.
So I think that is a remarkable gift to our community and neighborhood. If you've not ever been there, I encourage you, those listening and watching, to go check it out. The park is beautiful. It is fun, especially on these hot days when you want to go. There are some mosquitoes. I will give you the heads up to watch out for those. But even in the fall when the leaves are changing in the winter, it's a beautiful, beautiful space. Now, as far as getting involved in other ways, when's your next work day, Tom? That's probably, I would be remiss to not say
Well,
that.
we take the summer and the worst of the winter off. Okay. So it'd probably be September. Usually our work day is the second Saturday.
Sure.
So I think might be the 14th.
Okay. And there's a Facebook group.
We have Facebook.
It's called
page,
Friends of
Frazier-Rowe Park.
Okay.
And then at the entrance to the park by the parking lot, we have a kiosk and there's an announcement there about the work days.
Great.
And my email address is on there. And also Brenda Busby, who does the planting. Okay. Her email address is there.
Great.
So if that's what you're interested in, you can get in touch directly with her.
Perfect. And I'll do my best to put that in the show notes for the podcast here, so people could reach out directly and find those places, find the Friends of Frazier-Rowe Park website, and that part as well. Well, now, how do you see the park interacting with the neighborhood as sort of its own entity? Not quite an organism, but sort of. How do you see the park benefiting the neighborhood and some of the inhabitants here?
Well, we've had programs at times, including musical programs, which are nice and usually are local musicians, which has been fun. I think the Mount Zion AME Church has used it on occasion, the pavilion.
Great.
For events, especially with their choir.
They have a great choir.
Yeah. So there are things like that.
Okay.
But, otherwise it's there for everybody to enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad for it being there, and I'm glad for your paying attention. And when someone asked, you said, "Sure, I'll go. Send me." But also, what have I gotten myself into? I'm sure there's been
like
some of those
SPR.
moments.
None of it's been quite like that.
Well, hopefully. I think one of the things that I love about Atlanta is that we're a city of trees, parks, fountains. That's sort of what we're known for. When I was a kid, I was growing up, said I'd never live in Atlanta because there were no trees. Well, I live in a neighborhood full of trees. And
Yes.
because of things like Trees Atlanta and Park Pride and other places, there are a lot of these pocket parks and larger parks like Frazier-Rowe and others that we have in our area. And parks often, Frederick Law Olmsted was contracted to make the Olmsted Parks, which we call them now, along Ponce de Leon, leading from, at that time, the city, and the rail car went out that way. But those parks themselves, and Olmsted, again, designing parks all over the place, all over the world, but parks served as a sort of a public commons, a place for everyone to enjoy. Naturalists talk about parks in cities as sort of a lung, a breathing space.
Right.
Whether it's that quiet space for contemplation, like Pastor Amy walking and doing her sermon, or me being the photography nerd walking around, or just for people who have 20 minutes to kill and you've got a 4-year-old and you need to find out something to do, playground or otherwise, that fills that time with something meaningful. And is in getting into nature and enjoying that and making that something good for you and for the world. And so it takes these kinds of places and neighbors and friends who do that for other people to make places like Oak Grove and the neighborhoods around it to be a place where people want to be, a place where people feel like they belong. And I think parks play a large part in that.
Yeah, and in DeKalb, because it's so developed, there aren't going to be many places.
Sure.
And so that was what was neat about that property. It's now 9 or 10 acres, in the middle of a pretty fully developed area, backs up to a school. And so when there are opportunities like that, same thing at Briar Lake Park. It was an unusual, even bigger piece of property. So when there are things like that come available, it's good that people at the county are awake and, interested in stepping up.
Yeah. Helping maintain those green spaces for us and for other people as well. So,
I grew up not far from Olmsted. I grew up right off Ponce de Leon, and that what's now Deep Dean Park, which was just, and so I spent a lot of time there, and maybe that's where I developed my interest in.
Got the bug.
I got the bug.
Yeah.
Literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
Well, and Frazier-Rowe's a little unusual too, because I don't think there was ever a home there. And I kept looking for signs of that, and didn't. I've
not found anything. Sort of my brain thinks in that same way. Like, where would there have been a house out here? I don't. Maybe up on top of the hill where the pavilion ended up, but that's still.
No. Well, there was a house where the gravel lot is.
Okay, but right
next to the pavilion,
but nothing further back.
No,
that's fascinating.
No, you had asked me the other day about Oak Grove and what that means to you, and I thought about it some more. And when I meet somebody who lives in Atlanta, but not here.
Yeah.
And they ask me where I live. I tell them I live in the Oak Grove area in DeKalb County.
Yeah.
And that's how I think of it, as an area, not necessarily a neighborhood.
Gotcha.
But it's an area. And I gather our church draws predominantly from, you could put a radius of 3 or 4 or 5 miles, and that's where most of our people come from.
Yeah, and I can show the overlay of this. I've done it in some other podcast episodes previous to this one, where I show, when I first got here, I'm a spatial analysis nerd, being a forestry major.
A lot of nerds, I got nerdy qualities.
I got a lot of nerd hats. I went to Emory twice, so I'm very nerdy. But one thing I did was take the addresses for our church membership, no names attached, nothing, and put it in a private Google map, and then look at all the dots.
Yeah.
And then draw some polygons around that, and my Lord, we own some of these neighborhoods as far as the people and places. But then you can also see over the years sort of how we've expanded in different directions or not in others. And it gives you a sense of sort of what neighborhoods and what areas are Oak Grove Methodist Church people. But there's a nice sense of understanding of what the community is, even for my neighbors who are not necessarily religious or they're of some other faith tradition, they're Buddhist or Sikh or Baha'i or Muslim. We'll see each other on the playground every single time. We'll see each other at the elementary school, at the PTA meeting, out at the park. And that is a part of what makes our community strong, I think.
Absolutely.
And this church understands that through leadership like folks like you, but also through our understanding that God wants all of our people in the area to do better, to have healthier lives, to understand love, and to understand belonging that we experience in Jesus Christ. And I think that's absolutely essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
And thank you all for watching and enjoying the podcast here. If you want to see some of those images or other things, you can find them below here. I'll post a link to their Facebook page for Friends of Frazier-Rowe Park, and also some information that we have in the show notes as well about how to get a hold of Tom or the gardening team as well.
And there's Piney Grove has a Facebook page as well.
Yeah.
Piney Grove Cemetery.
Well, I'll put that in the show notes too, so you can find more information about that. Well, thank you, Tom, for being here and being a part of the podcast. Really enjoyed having you on.
My pleasure.
And I'll put all the links in the show notes to all these things. And this is our final episode of this podcast that's been about sort of the Oak Grove neighborhood. I hope that it's been interesting to learn about the history of Oak Grove, about some of our missional perspectives, about some of the ways that our building and grounds of the church are used in ministry, not just for us, but also for our neighbors, and how we as a church understand that the church does not exist just for itself, that Oak Grove exists for the entire Oak Grove area, whether that's a series of neighborhoods or an overlay of kind of where we exert some sort of meaningful interaction and influence with people. But all of that is important because we want people to know that they belong, that they're loved, and that we as people who are a part of Oak Grove United Methodist Church are called to show and share God's love by, again, living out our faith in the world. So thanks for checking things out. Please go check out the Frazier-Rowe Park and other things that Tom and I have talked about today. And we'll look forward to seeing you later on here in the fall for a podcast about the wisdom of the sages and the folks who've experienced a little more life around us. But more to come on that coming up in September. We'll see you then. Bye.